Hey, and welcome to the third short lecture from Chapter 6 in your textbook. And here we're going to talk more about the purist approach to the cultural perspective on organizational communication. So, as we talked about before, the purist approach focuses heavily on the study of cultural expression. So, it's all about symbols, conversations, artifacts, rituals, practices, all the things that are visual examples of a culture. So for a pragmatist, right? So for the other folks, they'd say that these expressions represent an underlying culture. Purists say that these expressions are what actually brings culture into being, right? So again, pragmatists would look at things like symbols, conversations, rituals, practices, and say that these are representative of the underlying culture. For purists, they say, no, 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 these are the culture. This is what makes culture. And so they look at these symbolic forms and they've divided them into a bunch of areas that they can consider. These include relevant constructs, facts, practices, vocabulary, metaphors, rites and rituals, and stories. So we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these. So relevant constructs are things that help make or help organization members make sense of their experience or to structure their experience. So for students, for example, for you, a relevant construct might be a grade, right? Your grades are ways that help you structure and make sense of your college experience. It's the same thing with assignments, and it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be an institutionally approved thing either. A relevant construct can be outside the realm of management or the people in charge, right? So partying can be a relevant construct for a college student and help you make sense of school. Now, because there are different subcultures within an organizational culture, different members of an organization could identify with different constructs, right? So, in college, students involved with Greek life, if you're in a fraternity or sorority, might identify with constructs of brotherhood or sisterhood, right? These are ways of you making sense of your environment. And so maybe you make sense of it that way. If you're in college and you're an athlete, maybe you make sense of it in terms of football games or basketball games or practices or any of the stuff that surrounds college athletics. Now, facts are a little different. Now, every organizational culture has a body of social knowledge that's shared by the members that allows those members then to navigate the culture. Now, when we call these things facts, it's important to realize that these are organizational culture facts. These aren't facts in the traditional sense. So facts are really, in this context, are really just shared understandings about what's significant and meaningful to the organization and its members. So an example of one for college might be if your college roommate dies, you automatically get a 4.0 for the semester. Now, this is something that I've heard, when I went to school, at some of the schools I've taught at in the past, including Gordon, this is what people might consider to be an organizational fact. It's part of that body of knowledge that helps people navigate the culture. Now, the fact that it's not true and never was true, that's not important, right? This is still an organizational fact, even if it's not true. So, in organizations, we find that people can possess facts that are not accurate, but are facts nonetheless. And so, your book cites the DeSantis study of cigar smokers, where they looked at these cigar smokers and talked to them about the facts that they share in terms of facts being social knowledge, and looked at how they sort of created their own alternative universe where they all shared these facts that weren't necessarily true, nevertheless, these quote unquote facts for them help to define their culture and help them navigate everyday lived experience. The same could be said of people like those involved with the QAnon conspiracy theory, where they think that Donald Trump is here to save us from a cabal of liberal Democrat pedophiles and cannibals, right? So there are literally millions of people in the United States who believe that Donald Trump is here to save us from Democrats who drink children's blood and rape them in the back of a pizza shop, oftentimes in Washington, D.C. And people believe these things. These are organizational facts. They're informal, right? They're not true, but that doesn't change the fact that again, this is commonly shared beliefs, I guess we could call them, amongst this group of people that help them navigate their world and the world of their organization. Practices, these are things that we do, right? So meetings are an example of practices, right? We all get together, we sit, we talk. They're also relevant constructs, by the way. One thing can fall into more than one category. So meetings are both practices and relevant constructs. And these practices are made up of a bunch of behaviors that people are supposed to engage in given a context, right? And they're more complicated than you might even think. Even a meeting is more complicated than you might think. You might think that it's as simple as a bunch of people sitting around exchanging ideas, but there's a bunch of stuff you need to know when you go into a meeting. You have to understand your role within the meeting, right? What's your job? Are you the chairman? Are you just there to sit and listen? Are you supposed to contribute? What are the rules of the meeting? When are you allowed to speak? What are you expected to deliver to the meeting, if anything? Are you allowed to respond to people's ideas, right? Are you allowed to respond to what they say? What's the agenda? What are they going to talk about, right? What can be said and what can't be said from both a professional and a cultural perspective, right? So, there are all kinds of rules, particularly informal rules, like what can be said and what can't be said, that govern organizations, right, and organizational practices. And college is no different, right? Going to class and participating in a class is both a practice and a relevant construct. And of course, there are all kinds of things that you need to know about class before you go in. That relate to behaviors and ways that you're allowed to communicate and ways that you're not allowed to communicate. There are formal rules like the ones laid out in the syllabus, and then there are informal rules. I mean, we all know that we can't say whatever we want to say whenever we want to say it, right? It's as terrible as that may be, right? There are things that even if you think about them critically and consider them deeply, there are things that you're simply not allowed to say within the context of organizations, schools, businesses, whatever, right? Then vocabulary, so jargon. Organization members use specific vocabulary that describes important aspects of the culture. It's a symbol of belonging to use that language. So when we're in this class, you learn vocabulary words so that you can be part of this organization, part of this group of people, of college students, college professors, right? The educated. All of these organizations are cultures of people. And the vocabulary that you learn here, learning it is part of that sort of right of admittance. It's something you have to learn to be part of the organization. Now, of course, we can also use jargon to denigrate non-members. So we could talk about people that aren't part of the organization or aren't part of the group using jargon as a way of bringing ourselves together, right? So, for example, I think your book talks about this with firemen, right? Firemen commonly refer to homeless people as shit bums, right? A shit box is an ambulance that you use to take a homeless person to the hospital. These are words, jargon that they use to make fun of people that aren't firemen, right? And by using this, they establish a sense of camaraderie amongst themselves. They define themselves by not being shit bums, right? They're defined by what they are not, and by making fun of these people, it makes them come closer together. Now, these terms, when taken as a whole, help to organize collective experience and your professional identity, right? The jargon, be it pejorative like shit bum, or even just fancy academic words, all these things help you form your professional identity, and they help to organize the experience of the group, right? And so in this sense, Purists argue that vocabulary helps to shape our organizational reality. Now, metaphors are also commonly studied by purists. So they look at metaphors to gain insight into how members experience and make sense of their organization, right? We can tell by the metaphors that people use how they see their own organizational culture, right? And how that is different oftentimes than how managers try to engineer that culture, or how the people in charge try to present that culture, right? And so your book gives us an example of workplace, how the study of workplace bullying helps to address real-life workplace issues. So again, the purists argue that the management's trying to put out one kind of culture, right? They're trying to make everyone ascribe to a single culture. But if we look at the metaphors that organizational members use, right? Working here is like X, right? If we look at those kinds of metaphors, we get a better understanding of how they really experience their time in the workplace and what it's like to work in an organization. And then very important to this whole mode of thinking are the examinations of rites and rituals, right? And we know that all organizations practice rites and rituals. And it's through these rituals that organizational reality really becomes stable and forms patterns, right? So with a college, for example, we could look at the ritual of graduation in May, right? That consistent every year people graduating in May, that forms a pattern, right? That then becomes part of the organization and organizational life, right? And we have these rituals because people want stability, right? They want a predictable workplace. They want a place where things don't change every day, where they can count on rituals and things to occur with consistency, right? People look for that. Now, rituals can be formal or informal, right? So, when I went to high school, we had graduation, which was a formal thing, but we also had freshman day, which was an informal thing where if you weren't a freshman, then you went out and you picked on all the new freshmen, right? Beat them up, pulled pranks on them, right? All that kind of stuff. I remember one freshman day, me and my friends duct taped freshmen to the wall of lockers, right? We just took out duct tape and actually duct taped them to the wall and left them there. Now, that wasn't a formal ritual by any means, but it was an informal one. And it helped form our idea of that organization and being part of it and how we saw the high school. So these things like freshman day can be seen as rites of passage sometimes, right? You went through that, and then once you got through it, you were part of the group, right? The same can be said of hazing in a fraternity or even graduation. Once you get through it, you're part of a group, right? You're part of the group of college graduates. So they can be rites of passage. They can work to integrate organizational members, bring people into the fold, right? We can have things known as rites of enhancement, and these are rituals or rites that increase the status of organizational members through public recognition. So when we say that someone graduated magna cum laude, for example, everyone gets up and claps, and we acknowledge what a great job they did, right? And that would be a rite of enhancement, where it increases their status. Now, there are also rites of degradation. And this is when organizations have problems, and the top organizational members have to acknowledge these problems in order to address them. So a rite of degradation is when you come out and say, yes, I know there's been a lot of bad things happening in my corporation, but, right? And you're going to acknowledge how you're going to fix those. So an example of rite of degradation can be seen here, if you want to watch this video, with Mark Zuckerberg facing Congress and answering questions about the 2016 elections and the behavior of Facebook. This was a rite of degradation. Nothing really happened to Mark Zuckerberg. He was still enormously wealthy. Nothing changed with his organization. But he went out and was publicly berated by politicians, and acknowledge these problems in a way that seemed to let society know that he had intentions of dealing with them. Another important aspect that cultural purists look at is organizational storytelling. Now, this is probably the most studied aspect of organizational culture, because storytelling is really one of the most important ways that we produce and reproduce our social reality. So we tell stories, and it's how we make sense of our world, right? We make sense of our own lives by telling stories, right? I was born in this place, and then I went and did this, and then I did that, and now I'm here, right? We even ask people, what's your story? Right? I mean, it shows you, stories are how we make sense of the world. Indeed, Walter Fisher says that human beings should be called homo narrans, right, as in like narrative, and says our identity is based in large part on our ability to construct coherent narratives about ourselves, right? And so researchers have studied this. People like Lucas have studied, for example, the working class narrative. So people who define themselves as working class Americans. What goes into the stories they tell about themselves? Well, there are 4 elements, according to Lucas, right? They believe in a strong work ethic, in providing for their families, in the dignity of all work, and they have a sense of humility, and that these are key elements in every single one of the stories that they tell about themselves, right? And so this narrative, the working class narrative, is a narrative that operates on a moral imperative, that the people associate their morality with these stories that they tell about themselves and about their workplaces, right? And of course, this particular one operates in tension with the narrative of the American dream, right? Which is that, if you work hard, you'll get ahead, and that we should really praise people who are rich because they've earned it, and so on, right? Which, if you don't know already, that's usually not the case, right? Just because someone is rich doesn't mean they've earned it or succeeded through hard work, right? Indeed, people oftentimes succeed through luck, right? And that's a harsh realization for many, but it's one that's nevertheless true, right? And doesn't really square entirely with the study of the working class narrative, which is if you work hard, you'll get ahead. So there are common scripts in the stories we tell about organizations. We like to think that our organizations are very distinct and unique, when in truth they're not. We find the same kinds of stories being told across a wide variety of organizations, and this has been identified by researchers, right? There's the CEO reaction story, for example, right, which is the story about how the CEO reacts to an observable transgression, right? Whether they're cool about it, or if they're dicks about it, or what have you, right? But it's all the same kind of story that we find repeated in organizations. How did the boss act when this happened? These are stories that are told in all different kinds of organizations. So, stories perform a sense-making function, right? They teach us what's important to pay attention to in the organization. They tell us things about that particular organization, culture, or society, right? And specifically, these stories tell us what people value, what is important, right, in terms of these organizations. And so, of course, we tell stories all the time. And at this point, if we were in class, I'd ask you, what kind of stories do we tell as Americans, right? Because, I mean, as Americans, we're all part of one organization. What kind of stories do we tell as Southerners, right? It's interesting to think about the kinds of stories that are favored in various groups and what those stories say about us and who we are as a group of people, right? So, I'll let you mull over this slide, right? But the whole idea here is that I'm trying to give you a way of contrasting these two approaches to this cultural perspective. There's the pragmatist approach, which we talked about first, and then the purist approach, which we talked about later. But really some of the key differences. In the purist approach, organization is a culture, right? Whereas in the pragmatist approach, organizations have culture, right? if you follow the pragmatist approach, you also believe that you can engineer culture. Whereas if you're following the purist approach, you say organizations are culture. Right? So the pragmatists are all about increasing effectiveness, and the purists are all about just describing and studying cultures for the sake of, for their own sake, just because they're complex communication systems. All right, that's it for Chapter 6. Thanks for checking out my videos.